The night sky above Chatham, Ontario, in the winter of 1858, was so cold that breath turned to ice crystals before it could reach the ground. The stars were sharp as broken glass, each one a puncture wound in the black fabric of the heavens. Among those stars, the constellation that mattered most was the one that pointed north, the drinking gourd, the Big Dipper, the celestial compass that had guided thousands across the invisible line between bondage and something that might, if you squinted hard enough through the frost, resemble freedom. Inside a modest clapboard structure that served as both school and meeting hall, John Brown sat at a wooden table that had been scarred by 1,000 desperate conversations. The table's surface was a map of anxiety, knife marks, water stains, the circular burns left by oil lamps that had illuminated plans whispered in the dark hours before dawn. Brown was a white man with eyes like a biblical prophet who had stared too long into the furnace of injustice. Across from him sat a collection of men whose names would be deliberately erased from most history books: Osborne Perry Anderson, a free black man who worked as a printer; Isaac Holden, who had escaped from a plantation in Missouri; and James Monroe Jones, whose hands still bore the rope scars from his own flight to freedom. The mystery they faced that night was simple in its statement but catastrophic in its implications. How do you strike at the heart of an institution that has the full weight of law, custom, military might, and economic power behind it? How do you wage war when you have no army, no treasury, and no nation willing to acknowledge your humanity? The challenge was to plan an assault on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, a federal armory that held enough weapons to arm a revolution. The payoff, if they succeeded, would be the spark that would ignite a conflagration across the South, a coordinated uprising that would shatter the chains of 4 million enslaved people. But here's the deeper mystery that haunted the frozen room: why was this conspiracy being planned on Canadian soil? The answer reveals a truth that most national narratives prefer to keep buried. The story of black resistance in North America is not a story of two separate nations, but a single, continental nervous system. When one part of the body felt pain, the signal traveled north across the border. When one part fought back, the tremor was felt in both directions. Canada, in the decade before the American Civil War, was not the peaceful multicultural haven that modern mythology suggests. It was a pressure cooker of its own, a place where approximately 40,000 black refugees had created communities that existed in a strange liminal space, legally free but socially constrained, geographically safe but economically precarious. The mystery for these communities was existential. Could you truly be free when your mother, your brother, your child remained in chains just a few hundred miles south? Could you build a life knowing that bounty hunters still crossed the border illegally, that the Fugitive Slave Act had turned every black person in North America into potential prey? Osborne Perry Anderson understood this mystery in his bones. He had been born free in Pennsylvania but had moved to Chatham because even free black people in the northern United States lived under a sword of Damocles. In Canada West, he worked for Mary and Chet Carey's Provincial Freeman, setting type for articles that challenged both American slavery and Canadian complacency. The challenge he faced was philosophical: if you are safe, do you have an obligation to those who are not? If you have escaped the burning building, do you run back inside to rescue others, even if it means you might burn? When Brown's plan was revealed at that meeting, which would later be called the Chatham Convention, it was audacious to the point of madness. They would seize the armory, distribute weapons to enslaved people in the surrounding area, and establish a provisional government in the Appalachian Mountains, creating a free state within the slave states, a sanctuary that would grow like a cancer in the body of the Confederacy until the entire system collapsed. The payoff was nothing less than the complete destruction of slavery. The risk was equally absolute: capture meant torture and execution. 46 men attended that convention in Chatham, and they did something extraordinary. They drafted a constitution for a new nation that didn't yet exist, a provisional government that would operate in the mountains, a parallel America built on the principle of universal human dignity. Article 1 stated, whereas, slavery throughout its entire existence in the United States is none other than a most barbarous, unprovoked, and unjustifiable war of one portion of its citizens upon another portion. This was not a plea for gradual reform. This was a declaration of war. The mystery deepened when you consider who else was in that room. Among the attendees were women, a fact that most historical accounts conveniently omit. Black women who had escaped slavery, who had lost children to the auction block, who carried scars on their backs and trauma in their souls. They didn't just attend, they voted. In 1858, decades before Canadian or American women would be granted suffrage, these women participated in the democratic process of creating a revolutionary government. The challenge they represented was the intersection of race and gender, a double bind that made their very existence a threat to the social order. The payoff of the Chatham Convention was not what Brown had hoped. The raid on Harper's Ferry in October 1859 was a military disaster. Brown was captured, tried, and hanged. But here's what the history books often miss: Osborne Perry Anderson escaped. He made it back to Canada, and he did something that transformed failure into legacy. He wrote a book, A Voice from Harper's Ferry, published in 1861, that documented the raid from the perspective of a black participant. He solved the mystery of historical erasure by refusing to let white historians control the narrative. The challenge of memory is that it is always contested. The dominant culture writes the first draft, but the payoff comes when the marginalized write the revision. Anderson's account ensured that the Harper's Ferry raid would be remembered not as the fantasy of a white fanatic, but as a multiracial coalition of people who chose to fight rather than wait for freedom to be granted. The invisible architecture, building freedom in the margins. While Anderson was writing his account in Canada, another mystery was unfolding in the drawing rooms and church basements of black communities across the North. The challenge was practical. How do you build institutions that can sustain a community when the larger society is designed to exclude you? The payoff would be the creation of a parallel universe of schools, newspapers, mutual aid societies, and businesses that operated in the shadows of the official economy. In Toronto, a man named Wilson Ruffin Abbott was solving this mystery through capitalism. Abbott had escaped from slavery in Alabama, made his way to Canada, and by the 1850s had become one of the wealthiest black men in North America. He owned substantial real estate in Toronto, and he used his wealth strategically. The challenge he faced was not just personal success but collective elevation. He funded schools for black children, supported the provincial freemen, and used his properties to house refugees arriving via the Underground Railroad. But Abbott's story contains a darker mystery that reveals the complexity of Canadian racism. In 1849, he attempted to enroll his children in the Toronto public schools. He was refused. The school board argued that black children should attend separate schools. Abbott fought back, taking the case to court, and he won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The payoff was that his children could technically attend, but the social pressure was so intense that many black families chose to create their own schools rather than subject their children to daily hostility. This is the mystery that Canada has never fully confronted. Segregation existed not primarily through law but through custom, through unwritten rules that were enforced by social pressure rather than police power. The challenge for historians is that this kind of racism is harder to document, easier to deny, and more insidious in its long-term effects. There are no whites-only signs to photograph, no Jim Crow laws to cite, just a pattern of closed doors, refused service, and opportunities that somehow never materialized for black applicants. The payoff of this hidden segregation was that black Canadians became experts at building alternative structures. In Hamilton, the British Methodist Episcopal Church became not just a place of worship but a hub for political organizing, education, and economic cooperation. In Windsor, the True Band Society created a mutual aid network that provided insurance, burial funds, and small business loans to black families. These institutions solved the mystery of survival in a hostile environment by creating self-sufficient ecosystems. By the time the American Civil War erupted in 1861, the black communities in Canada faced a new challenge: should they return to fight? The mystery was whether the war would actually end slavery or merely preserve the Union. The payoff for those who chose to fight was the possibility of liberation for their families still in bondage. Approximately 1,000 black Canadians crossed the border to enlist in the Union Army, many joining the famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment. But here's the twist that most narratives miss: some black Canadians opposed the war, not because they supported slavery, but because they didn't trust Abraham Lincoln's motives. Mary and Chad Carey, who had spent years building a life in Canada, initially argued that black people should focus on building their own nation in Canada rather than fighting for a country that had never valued them. The challenge she articulated was profound: why die for a nation that considers you 3/5 of a human being? The mystery resolved when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Suddenly, the war's purpose shifted, and the payoff became clear: this was no longer just a war to preserve the Union but a war to end slavery. Chad Carey changed her position, crossed the border, and became a recruiting officer for the Union Army, traveling through Indiana enlisting black soldiers. She solved the mystery of her own ambivalence by recognizing that sometimes you have to fight for a promise even when you don't trust the person making it. The reconstruction of memory, who gets to tell the story? The end of the Civil War in 1865 created a new mystery for black communities on both sides of the border. What happens now? The challenge for those in Canada was whether to return to the United States or remain in a country that had provided refuge but not equality. The payoff would depend on which gamble seemed less dangerous, returning to a South in chaos or staying in a North that had never fully welcomed them. Approximately half of the black population in Canada returned to the United States during Reconstruction. They went back to find family members, to reclaim property, or because they believed the promise of Reconstruction would create a new America. The other half stayed, and they faced the challenge of building a permanent black Canadian identity. The mystery was how to maintain connections to the struggle in the United States while also demanding full citizenship in Canada. This is where the story gets deliberately obscured by nationalist narratives. Both the United States and Canada wanted to claim the moral high ground of the abolitionist movement, but neither wanted to acknowledge the full complexity of black resistance. American textbooks taught that the Underground Railroad ended in Canada, as if crossing the border was the conclusion of the story rather than the beginning of a new chapter. Canadian textbooks taught that Canada was a haven of tolerance, conveniently omitting the segregated schools, the discriminatory employment practices, and the racial violence that black Canadians faced. The challenge for black intellectuals in the late 19th century was to create a counter-narrative that told the truth. The mystery was how to do this without access to mainstream publishing, without academic positions, without the resources that white historians took for granted. The payoff came through the creation of black newspapers, self-published memoirs, and community archives that preserved the stories that official history wanted to forget. In 1890, a man named Benjamin Drew published A North Side View of Slavery, a collection of interviews with formerly enslaved people living in Canada. Drew was white, but he had the integrity to let his subjects speak in their own voices. The book is a masterpiece of oral history, capturing the mystery of what it felt like to cross the border into freedom. One woman described the moment she realized she was in Canada. "I felt as light as a feather. I had been in a dark room, and now I was in the light." But she also described the challenge. "I thought I would find everything different in Canada. But I found prejudice here too, just not written into the law." The payoff of Drew's book was that it created a permanent record of black voices that could not be easily erased. But the mystery that haunts us today is how many other voices were never recorded, how many stories died with the people who lived them because no one thought their testimony was worth preserving. The Great Migration and the Reverse Current. The early 20th century brought a new challenge to the continental narrative of black resistance. The Great Migration saw millions of black Americans move from the rural South to the urban North, seeking economic opportunity and escape from Jim Crow terror. But there was also a smaller, lesser-known migration, black Canadians moving to American cities like Detroit, Chicago, and New York, drawn by the same economic forces. This created a mystery that challenged the simple narrative of Canada as refuge. If Canada was so much better, why were black Canadians leaving? The answer reveals the payoff of honest historical analysis. Canada offered legal freedom and safety from lynching, but it did not offer economic opportunity on the same scale as American industrial cities. A black man in Windsor, Ontario, might be legally equal, but he would struggle to find work beyond manual labor. That same man could cross the river to Detroit and find a job in an auto factory that paid 3 times as much, even if he faced worse legal discrimination. The challenge for black communities was that they had to navigate a complex calculus of risk and reward. The mystery was that there was no perfect choice, only different configurations of oppression and opportunity. The payoff was the development of a transnational black consciousness that didn't recognize borders as meaningful boundaries. Families had members on both sides of the border. Churches had sister congregations in different countries. Activists moved fluidly between Toronto and Detroit, Montreal, and New York, treating the border as an administrative inconvenience rather than a cultural divide. In the 1920s, Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association established chapters across Canada, bringing the challenge of black nationalism to a new generation. Garvey's mystery was how to create a unified black identity that transcended the national divisions that white supremacy had imposed. His payoff was the largest mass movement of black people in history, with millions of members across the Americas. But Garvey's story also reveals the limits of transnational organizing. He was arrested in the United States on mail fraud charges that most historians now agree were politically motivated. The challenge for his Canadian followers was whether to continue the movement without its charismatic leader. The mystery was whether the movement was about Garvey the man or the ideas he represented. The payoff was that UNIA chapters in Montreal and Toronto continued to operate for decades after Garvey's deportation, proving that the movement had transcended its founder. In Montreal's Little Burgundy neighborhood, the UNIA Hall became a center for Black cultural and political life. This was the mystery of diaspora. How do you create community among people from Jamaica, Nova Scotia, the American South, and Haiti who share skin color but not language, religion, or culture? The challenge was to find common ground. The payoff was the creation of a distinctly Black Canadian identity that was Caribbean in flavor, American in its civil rights consciousness, and Canadian in its specific grievances. The Sleeping Car Porters, Mobile Resistance. The story of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters reveals another mystery in the continental narrative of Black resistance. How do you organize workers who are constantly moving, who work in isolation from each other, and who can be fired for the slightest hint of union activity? The challenge was to create solidarity among men who worked on trains that crossed the border between Canada and the United States dozens of times a month. Sleeping car porters were almost exclusively Black men, hired by the Pullman Company to serve wealthy white passengers on overnight trains. The job was considered prestigious within Black communities because it was steady employment that paid better than most alternatives, but it was also brutal. Porters worked 100-hour weeks, slept in cramped quarters, and endured constant racial humiliation. They were called George regardless of their actual names, a reference to George Pullman, as if they were his property rather than employees. The mystery was how to fight back against a company that had crushed every previous attempt at unionization. The payoff would be not just better wages and working conditions, but dignity, the right to be called by your own name, the right to be treated as a human being rather than a servant. Philip Randolph, an American socialist and civil rights leader, took up the challenge in 1925, founding the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. But the story that's often forgotten is that Canadian porters were essential to the union's success. The Pullman Company operated on both sides of the border, and porters who worked the Montreal to New York or Toronto to Chicago runs were perfectly positioned to carry information, smuggle union literature, and coordinate strategy. Stanley Grizzle, a porter based in Toronto, became one of the union's most effective organizers. The mystery he solved was how to recruit members without getting caught. He would wait until the train crossed into Canada, where Pullman's anti-union detectives had less authority, and then quietly approach porters during their breaks. The payoff was that by 1937, the Brotherhood had won recognition from the Pullman Company, becoming the first Black union to negotiate a collective bargaining agreement with a major American corporation. But Grizzle's story doesn't end there. The challenge he faced after the Union victory was what to do with the organizing skills he had developed. The mystery was how to apply the tactics of labor organizing to the broader struggle for civil rights. The payoff was that Grizzle became one of the founding members of the Negro Citizenship Association in Toronto, which fought against discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. This is the pattern that repeats throughout the continental narrative. Skills learned in one struggle get transferred to another. The mystery is how knowledge travels, how tactics evolve, how a victory in one arena creates the conditions for fighting in another. The payoff is a cumulative building of capacity, a ratcheting up of collective power that makes each successive battle slightly less impossible than the last. The Dresden Story, Small Town, Big Lessons. In the late 1940s, the mystery of Canadian racism was crystallized in a small town in southwestern Ontario called Dresden. The challenge was deceptively simple: could Black citizens be served in the town's restaurants and bars? The payoff would reveal whether Canada's self-image as a tolerant nation had any basis in reality. Dresden had a significant Black population, descendants of people who had arrived via the Underground Railroad a century earlier. But despite living in the town for generations, paying taxes, and contributing to the community, Black residents were routinely refused service at local businesses. The mystery was how this could happen in a country that had no segregation laws, that prided itself on being more enlightened than the United States. The challenge was taken up by Hugh Burnett, a Black veteran who had fought in World War II. Burnett had risked his life fighting fascism in Europe, and he returned to Canada expecting that his service would be honored. Instead, he was refused service at a Dresden restaurant. The mystery he faced was how to fight an enemy that wouldn't acknowledge it was fighting. At least in the American South, segregation was explicit. In Canada, it was deniable. Restaurant owners would claim they had the right to refuse service to anyone, that it wasn't about race, just personal preference. Burnett and other activists organized a campaign that lasted years. They held protests, they lobbied the provincial government, they brought journalists to document the discrimination. The payoff came in 1954 when Ontario passed the Fair Accommodation Practices Act, making it illegal to discriminate in public accommodations. But here's the twist: even after the law passed, some Dresden businesses continued to refuse service to black customers. The law had changed, but the culture hadn't. This reveals a deeper mystery that connects the Canadian and American experiences. Laws are necessary but not sufficient. The challenge is changing hearts and minds, dismantling the psychological architecture of white supremacy that exists independent of legal structures. The payoff is measured in generations, not years. It requires not just legislation but education, not just court victories but cultural transformation. The Dresden story also reveals how the American civil rights movement influenced Canadian activism. Burnett and his allies were inspired by tactics being used in the American South: sit-ins, boycotts, media campaigns. The mystery was whether these tactics would work in a context where the racism was more subtle, less violent, but no less real. The payoff was that they did work, but they required adaptation. In Canada, the battle was less about dramatic confrontations with police and more about persistent exposure of hypocrisy, forcing Canadians to confront the gap between their self-image and their actions. The 1960s, parallel revolutions. By the 1960s, the continental narrative of black resistance had reached a crescendo. The challenge in the United States was how to maintain momentum after the legal victories of the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. The mystery was whether integration was the goal or merely a tactic, whether black people wanted to join American society or transform it fundamentally. In Canada, the challenge was different but related. Black Canadians were watching the American civil rights movement on television, seeing the dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham, the March on Washington, the assassination of Malcolm X. The mystery was how to articulate their own grievances in a context where the oppression was less visible but still real. The Sir George Williams affair in 1969, mentioned briefly earlier, deserves deeper examination because it reveals the payoff of transnational consciousness. The 6 Caribbean students who accused their professor of racism were not African Americans, not black Canadians in the traditional sense, but part of a new wave of immigration from the West Indies. They brought with them a different political consciousness, shaped by anti-colonial struggles in their home countries. The challenge they faced was that Canadian institutions had no framework for understanding racism as a systemic problem. The mystery was how to make visible something that everyone insisted didn't exist. When they occupied the computer center, they were using tactics borrowed from the American student movement, but they were applying them to a Canadian context. The payoff was traumatic: arrests, deportations, criminal records, but it forced Canada to acknowledge that it had its own racial problems, not just imported ones. What's often forgotten is that the Sir George Williams affair happened in the same year as the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the riots that followed. The mystery is whether these events were connected, whether the uprising in Montreal was influenced by the rage and grief that swept through black communities across North America. The challenge for historians is to trace these invisible connections, to show how emotions and ideas flow across borders even when people cannot. The payoff of the Sir George Williams affair was institutional change, the creation of ombudsman offices, grievance procedures, and diversity initiatives at Canadian universities. But the deeper payoff was psychological. Black students in Canada learned that they didn't have to accept discrimination quietly, that they had the right to fight back, that their voices mattered. The Quiet Revolution and the Black Revolution. In Quebec, the 1960s brought the Quiet Revolution, a period of rapid secularization and modernization that transformed the province from a conservative, Catholic society into a progressive, nationalist one. But the mystery for black Quebecers was where they fit into this new Quebec identity. The challenge was that Quebec nationalism was framed primarily in terms of French language and culture, with little acknowledgement of the black francophone communities that had existed in Montreal for generations. Little Burgundy, the neighborhood that had been the heart of Black Montreal since the early 20th century, was facing a new threat in the 1960s: urban renewal. The mystery was whether renewal was a euphemism for removal, whether the real goal was to disperse the black community and gentrify the neighborhood. The challenge for residents was how to fight City Hall when they had little political power and even less media attention. The payoff came through coalition building. Black activists in Little Burgundy allied with white progressive groups, with other immigrant communities, and with the labor movement. They learned from the community organizing tactics of the American Civil Rights Movement, holding public meetings, documenting the history of the neighborhood, and making the case that Little Burgundy was not a slum to be cleared but a community to be preserved. But here's the complication: some black families wanted to leave Little Burgundy, wanted access to better housing in other neighborhoods, wanted their children to attend schools that weren't underfunded and overcrowded. The mystery was how to fight for both preservation and integration, how to honor the past while not being trapped by it. The payoff was partial. Some of the neighborhood was demolished, some was preserved, and black families dispersed across Montreal, creating new communities in different parts of the city. This pattern of dispersal and regathering is central to the Continental narrative. The mystery is how to maintain community and cultural continuity when the physical spaces that anchored identity are destroyed or transformed. The challenge is to create portable forms of belonging, institutions, traditions, networks that can survive displacement. The payoff is resilience, the ability to recreate community wherever black people find themselves. The Black Power movement and the border. The rise of black power in the late 1960s created a new mystery for the Continental narrative. Was the border between Canada and the United States a meaningful political boundary, or was it just a line on a map that white people had drawn? The challenge for black power activists was whether to organize nationally or transnationally, whether to focus on specific grievances in specific countries or to see the struggle as fundamentally global. The Black Panther Party, founded in Oakland in 1966, inspired the creation of similar organizations in Canada. In Halifax, the Black United Front was formed in 1969, bringing together activists from Africville, the historically black neighborhood that had been demolished by the city in the name of urban renewal. The mystery they faced was how to channel rage into political power, how to move from protest to governance. The challenge was complicated by the fact that many black power activists in Canada were American draft dodgers who had fled to Canada to avoid serving in Vietnam. They brought with them a radical political consciousness shaped by the American Black Power movement, but they were also outsiders in Canadian black communities. The mystery was whether their presence would energize or destabilize local organizing efforts. The payoff was a creative tension that produced new forms of activism. The American exiles brought organizing experience and connections to international networks. Canadian activists brought local knowledge and legitimacy. Together, they created organizations that were distinctly Canadian but connected to a global black liberation movement. In Toronto, the Black Education Project was founded in 1969 to address the systemic racism in the school system. The challenge was that black students were being streamed into vocational programs rather than academic ones, were being suspended at higher rates, and were being told by guidance counselors that they weren't university material. The mystery was how to prove that the problem was systemic rather than individual, that it wasn't about black students being less capable but about schools being structurally racist. The payoff came through research and documentation. Activists gathered data on suspension rates, on streaming patterns, on the racial demographics of advanced classes. They presented this evidence to school boards, to the media, to politicians. They forced the system to see itself, to confront the gap between its stated values of equality and its actual practices of exclusion. This is the pattern of effective activism: make the invisible visible, turn anecdotal experience into documented pattern, force institutions to acknowledge what they would prefer to deny. The mystery is always how to get those in power to care about injustice that doesn't affect them personally. The payoff is incremental change, small victories that accumulate over time into something that might, if you squint hard enough, resemble justice. The Long Arc, from Chatham to Ferguson. The Continental narrative of black resistance doesn't end in the 1960s. It continues through the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s, which devastated black communities on both sides of the border. It continues through the rise of hip-hop culture, which created a transnational black youth culture that transcended national boundaries. It continues through the election of Barack Obama in 2008, which created different reactions in black communities in the United States and Canada, celebration mixed with skepticism, hope mixed with the knowledge that one man's success doesn't dismantle systemic racism. And it continues through the Black Lives Matter movement, which began in the United States after the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the killing of Trayvon Martin but quickly spread to Canada. The mystery that Black Lives Matter articulates is the same mystery that has haunted the Continental narrative since the beginning. How do you make society value black life? The challenge is that this requires not just legal change but moral transformation, not just policy reform but a fundamental reimagining of whose humanity counts. In Canada, Black Lives Matter activists have focused on police violence against Black Canadians. Cases like Andrew Loku, shot by Toronto police in 2015, or Pierre Coriolan, killed by Montreal police in 2017. The payoff of their activism has been increased scrutiny of police practices, the creation of civilian oversight boards, and a growing acknowledgement that Canada is not immune to the problems that plague the United States. But the deeper payoff is the revival of historical consciousness. Black Lives Matter activists have excavated forgotten histories, have reminded Canadians about Africville, about the Dresden segregation, about the Sir George Williams affair. They have shown that the current crisis is not new but is part of a long pattern of anti-Black racism that has been denied and minimized. This is where the continental narrative comes full circle. The mystery that John Brown and Osborne Perry Anderson were trying to solve in Chatham in 1858, how to dismantle a system of oppression that has the full weight of law and custom behind it, is the same mystery that activists are grappling with today. The challenge remains how to build power when the system is designed to keep you powerless. The payoff is the knowledge that every generation has found ways to resist, to survive, to create beauty and meaning even in the midst of oppression. The call forward, unfinished business. The story of the Echo of the North Star is not a story with a neat conclusion. It is an ongoing broadcast, a live transmission that continues to this moment. The mystery for our generation is how to honor the sacrifices of those who came before while also acknowledging that their victories were incomplete, that the work they began remains unfinished. The challenge is to resist the temptation of nostalgia, to avoid treating history as a collection of inspiring stories about great individuals rather than as a guide for present action. The payoff will come when we understand that we are not separate from this history but are living inside it, that the choices we make today will determine whether the echo of the North Star continues to guide future generations or fades into silence. Your task, if you choose to accept it, is to become a link in the chain. Find one story from your own community, a story of resistance, of survival, of someone who refused to accept the limitations that society tried to impose. Document that story. Share it. Make sure it becomes part of the permanent record. Because the ultimate mystery is not what happened in the past but what will happen in the future. The challenge is whether we have the courage to continue the work that John Brown and Osborne Perry Anderson began in Chatham, that Viola Desmond continued in New Glasgow, that the students at Sir George Williams carried forward in Montreal. The payoff is a world where the North Star no longer needs to guide people to freedom because freedom exists everywhere, where the border between Canada and the United States is just a line on a map rather than a boundary between different forms of oppression. But that world doesn't exist yet. It remains a mystery, a challenge, and a potential payoff. And the only way it will ever come into being is if each of us chooses to be part of the Continental Symphony of Resistance, adding our voices to the chorus that has been singing for centuries, refusing to let the echo fade into silence.